Dr. Lerato Mokoena is a lecturer at the University of Pretoria in the Faculty of Theology and Religion, in the Department of Religious Studies, Old Testament and Hebrew Scriptures. I read that very wrong. She's also the secretary of the Old Testament Society in South Africa, as well as the secretary of a transformation committee in the Faculty of Theology and Religion. This child is doing a lot. Dr. Mokoena has subsequently been inducted into the Mail and Guardian list of top 200 young South Africans in the education category, and also the Advanced Media Top Women, Top 100 Most Influential Young South African for 2020. She's also inspiring 50 Women South African nominee for 2021. This child is working hard. And her research interests are Old Testament studies, specialization in gender performance, philosophy, wisdom, literature, and Deuteronomic history. In religion studies, her research interests are sociology of religion, Marxist interpretations of religion, philosophy of religion, and African traditional religion. She also does a lot of work of Black liberation theology, critical race theory, and feminism. And today she's going to be speaking to us. And her mothers, her fathers, her sisters, and her brothers. Welcome, Sisi. Take over. Thank you.
Sound good now, sound good.
Well, comrades, let me greet you. My colleague earlier on said that he welcomes you to Azania. I would like to welcome you to what I call an European island, which is South Africa. So I hope our encounters will be fruitful and that we are going to have engaging conversations today. And today I want us to focus our lenses. I appreciate my colleague Dr. Mdingi, who came and gave us the broader perspective of what Black liberation theology is. But now I want us to look at the intricacies, at the intramural inner workings of what Black liberation theology has done, and even found itself seeping into other subfields of theology. And this is why for a long time I was telling my colleague, my friend just now, I'm saying, people don't see biblical scholars because my primary specialization is Old Testament. People just call us biblical scholars. They don't think we are theologians. And I think that should be corrected. And I seek to do that with the work of Professor Madipoane Masenya, ngwana Mphahlele. Masenya is an Old Testament scholar. The woman I'll be talking with today, I regard her as a very serious intellectual interlocutor of mine. And I think in the broader sense of things, she's almost like my deputy mother in Old Testament studies. Masenya was the first Black woman to have a PhD in Old Testament studies in this country, which makes me the third. The second one... Well, thank you, comrades. Due to the violences of academia sometimes, the second one we have left academia and went back into the church. But she's still working with us. Professor Masenya works at the University of South Africa, but she's no longer in the Department of Biblical and Ancient Studies. She's now seconded to the office of the Vice Chancellor. So now she's working with university management. And I was asked sometime last year to write, we are working on a book project where we are writing about the legacies of African women theologians, because I'm part of what we call the Circle of Concerned African Women Theologians. So the Circle does a lot of work in wanting to elucidate, advance, defend, protect, and even grow this archive of African women theologians. And I was given the special task to write about my very own mother, Professor Masenya. And this chapter is what I want to share with you today, because I believe that ideas are tested on the ground. There's no use of us writing and then Routledge will make the book $1,000. So we need this work now. So I want us to go into it. And the title of this chapter is called Scenes of Abjection, the Bosadi Theology of Masenya Madipoane, ngwana Mphahlele. And she's very particular about this. Ngwana Mphahlele is a maiden name. So if you call Masenya just Masenya, you're going to have big problems with her. Masenya is her marriage surname. So she prefers to be called, she doesn't use the word double barrel. She just retained her maiden name. And the abstract goes as follows. The 80s and 90s are the formative years of gender-specific frameworks in biblical feminist interpretation. Scholars used this opportunity to formulate the unintelligible and the muted through interesting dialectics to fashion an archive without imitations of frameworks that excluded them and treated them as subjects. Amid these conditions of creating and understanding, Madipoane Masenya ngwana Mphahlele heralded a moment in this period and seized an ideological opportunity to jumpstart Bosadi theology as a matter of intellectual insurgency. Masenya played around the tensions of race, patriarchy, sexism, classism, and even colonialism and apartheid to examine the social and intimate lives of Black South African women. It was a necessary intervention as it is sought to contextualize South African Black and African women's unique experiences. This intellectual insurgency resulted from the lack of correct antagonistic grammar that Euro-feminist frameworks provided. There is no way they could fashion the nervous condition of being Black and being a woman in banishment. Those imported frameworks were gaslighting Black women, unleashing scandalous and boundless violence, and making it impossible for Black women to be interlocutors in this ideation space. Theirs was a grammar of uncivil, gratuitous, and predatory ubiquitous violence through epistemic canons. Madipoane had a dilemma as a Black intellectual, an enormous agency regarding the spiritual, existential, and psychocultural dimensions of Black women in South Africa. This chapter wants to trace the theological anthropology of Masenya, her sources of intellect, wisdom, and care for the quality of Black women's lives through a liberatory framework we call Bosadi Theology in South African biblical studies. I have a particular heightened sensitivity to liberatory frameworks that emerged for the benefit of Black life. I say Black life because to theorize about the Negro is to theorize about gender. So totalizing should not be taken to mean the absence of gender and even class contradictions. Bosadi is such a theory of freedom that also becomes the scene of abjection in theological terms for Black life, and as a result, I will explain why I totalize the Black experience. Bosadi becomes a valuable rubric of abjection and influences performance studies, aesthetics, theorization, and engaged theories about Black life, ipso facto Black women within theology and beyond. Masenya herself has characterized Bosadi as necessary. In her paper, their hermeneutics was strange, ours is a necessity. A necessary intervention to combat these strange biblical hermeneutics. Masenya has always written from the premise of critiquing androcentrism and creating a focused interpretative lens. It looks on the surface that Masenya is only simply critiquing patriarchy, but I argue that this is more complex than a reducible category. Patriarchy has a host antagonism. In this case, we are dealing with imperialist, white supremacist, capitalist patriarchy. It is important to frame this context so that I can easily explain and substantiate why I say the Bosadi theology of Masenya is not a broad church. Bosadi is a Black woman's standpoint, an interpretative lens of a woman who grows up in the early 60s in apartheid South Africa, an anti-Black regime committed to genocide, by simply saying apartheid does not quite capture the violence of such a regime. And since the word has been appropriated in so many ways around the world, and I would want to interject myself there, I was recently in the Islamic Republic of Iran, and Iran is under heavy sanctions right now. So there's literally nothing you can do. You can't use Apple Pay, you can't even use their own currency, you can't use the internet, it's filtered, so you need to download VPN to be able to access WhatsApp, Facebook, and whatnot. And a comrade says to me, this feels like economic apartheid. And I said, wow, it's sad. And this is why I want to speak about how this word has been appropriated in so many ways around the world. We even see with the case of Zionism and the question of Palestine, that how we speak about apartheid threatens how we speak about the white on hate hatred that happens in South Africa. It threatens how South Africans speak about apartheid because now it's playing on a global scale and the category of race has been removed from it. So globally, apartheid means system of separateness and segregation, but within the South African context, it is separatedness, segregation, and discrimination on the basis of skin color. So I call this practice theoretical convolution. My own coinage that means that the geopolitics of knowledge of a concept that is reappropriated in different contexts to refer to oppression that symbolically infers the same idea, but refers to oppression that ranges with its social practices based on ontology. So theoretical convolution poses a few dangers in how we tell this history, how we relate our personal experiences. Firstly, it takes away from those that have been harmed a portion of their voice, especially if this reappropriation takes place on a large scale. That poses as a contender geopolitically. I mean, Iran is quite big in the geopolitics of religious knowledge. So that would mean more coverage to them. So if I come as a Black South African to speak about apartheid, it's already convoluted within that thinking of apartheid as just segregation, but not anti-Blackness. Secondly, it pays little attention to the particularities of ontology and how the universality of concepts without the sensitivity to differences perpetuates further harm. Lastly, it fails to distinguish between intellectual preoccupation with ideas and experimenting with freedom. And that challenges different forms of existence. Indeed, multiple voices joining the discussion about oppression serve a purpose of delegitimizing and deprivileging mainstream positivist ideologies. But that should not be at the expense of subsidizing erasure and maintaining categories of negation through liberalism. Through the years, Masenya's works have received critical acclaim, world recognition, and interpretations. It is without a doubt she will go down in history as a pioneer. Her work has encouraged Black women's resistance by challenging prevailing approaches to oppression through theology and civil society. Chief amongst the responses from Bosadi Theology is generating a Black consciousness in Black women and men. Bosadi adopted, even without knowing at times, a heuristic healing approach that condemned patriarchy as a social disease that threatens both Black men and women. So please note my insistence to use Black throughout because I want to argue that Bosadi is not a broad church. What is surprising, however, is that what we have witnessed with many Black liberatory frameworks and ideas is their adoption by white people. In this instance, white women. Although we have biological similarities and experiences contradictions that mirror one another, we do not share in a grammar of suffering with white women. This is a particular interest to note because if we agree that the host antagonism of patriarchy is imperialist, white supremacist, capitalistic patriarchy, then white women benefit from our oppression. The position of the white woman is an interesting one in history because her formlessness makes her to be an oppressor and a victim all at once. White women are complicit in Black oppression and genocide, which should be noted because their engagement with feminism makes them look like a subordinate group, and that obscures their gains from oppression by simply being white people, not white women. So while the Black woman is a lesser human being, the white woman is included in the categories of what it means to be human, if we have to adopt Sylvia Wynter's sociological principle of autopoiesis. So Black women are oppressed because they are Black and they are women. They deal with these interlocking systems of oppression. That has been well documented and deliberated, and I don't wish to expand on that further. But it was just necessary to note. Masenya writes for Black women, and Bosadi to be reappropriated by dominant narratives who have had the luxury to enjoy institutional honor is unfair. Bosadi is not just an abstract theory in the corridors of biblical historiography. It is a life-giving form of protest. It allows Black women to dream, and it offers us camaraderie. And Bosadi is a sacred text by a Black woman for Black women. And this is why I don't engage in politics of sisterhood. I engage in politics of camaraderie, because it's sisterhood that has created waves in feminism. So if I refer to you as a comrade, then we know that we are operating on the principle. And the principle is black first, land first. So if I call you my sister, I'm convoluting ways of relatedness. But if I call you a comrade, you will offer me camaraderie even when you don't agree, because you are standing on a particular principle. And that is Bosadi Theology. The second subsection is titled Between Activism, Religiosity and the Public Sphere, the Intellectual Insurgency of Masenya. I borrowed this title of the subsection from a critical text titled Between Activism, Religiosity and the Public Sphere, the Intellectual Insurgency of Bell Hooks by Hugh Woodson. An essential essay for genealogies of thought that I feel pays the exact homage it does for bell hooks that I also want to relay about Masenya, who traces her intellectual heritage or critical consciousness, as she calls it, to the early experiences in the Black Church, in which religion in general, to the extent that her role as an intellectual is predicated on what we call this spiritual practice. So Masenya, in a short auto-introduction about herself, she traces her own critical consciousness to what she calls a journey of struggle. It is no big wonder what the struggle she's alluding to. Masenya grew up under genocide. However, within the struggle of the regime that discriminated and murdered you because you were black, Masenya, in the everyday occurrences of segregated bathrooms and living areas, realized that there was also separation on the basis of gender and sex. Enter Kimberly Crenshaw. So Masenya grew up in a wild-dominated male world. However, all those places were reserved between black and white, debilitated and well-kept, male or female, white women entered when white men entered. While in black spaces, the system primarily upheld and enforced sexual binaries. This was to create an essential tactic to divide and conquer amongst black men and women, and to create amongst us alien residents. Therefore, Bosadi must be included into the school of black abjection, black social life, and the social construction of black feminist thought. Masenya chronicles that it took her time to be able to appreciate the racial crisis she was born into, as she says, and I quote her, "My inability to realize the severity of the racial crisis was, in my view, caused by the fact that I could not interact with white folks regularly. Such an interaction could have not been enabled me to develop a better understanding of the evil nature of apartheid policy. The policy advocated for separate development of people in different races, deliberately making one race the norm of all others." This form of awareness towards one into an examination that requires the subject to discover their blackness. This is the case even for Fanon, who was thrown into his corporal malediction through relationality. Look, a Negro. I argue that Masenya lacked not the understanding or appreciation of the regime through relationality, but an encounter with her own corporeality through a process of this negation. You are black because you are not white, not because you have not encountered white people, but because the anti-black system defines your humanity, thereby inferring whiteness as the totality. Masenya experienced intersecting forms of oppression, including low quality and state-sanctioned education that did not offer her knowledge to transform society and address social skills. Geographically, she lived in segregation, and all of these circumstances provided her with a reality that was deprived of humanity and hermeneutics that was out of touch with the realities of her own people. She encountered a theology at the time that was predominantly white and male. Although theology at the time was characterized in this manner and was an exclusive exercise for the elite in ivory towers far removed from the people, she was still able to theologize about her reality by fashioning her own grammar of suffering. She was a theologian long before she became one. It is no surprise that religion was an anchor for black social life. It was a refugee ideology under oppression. Tracing her critical consciousness to religiosity meant that much of her criticism would be centered around discrimination and oppression in religious spaces. This is the space she was most drawn to, and one that shaped her views about life and the world. This was Masenya's sociology. Within this context of oppression and radical practices of open rebellion through text and riot, a theology that would benefit liberation emerged, not only for her, but for the black and academic intellectuals. The emergence of liberation theology was a way to cement the experiences of black people. And this is why often when people want to make the distinction between liberation theology and black liberation theology, when Gustavo Gutierrez was writing a theology of liberation, he was primarily asking, how can I pray to God when I'm hungry? But in South Africa, we say, is God a white racist? And that is the premise of black liberation theology. So the dilemma of the black intellectual is always this. Because of multiple, multifaceted intersections of oppression, one seldom finds it challenging to define oneself with a niche. Masenya is not just an Old Testament scholar. She's a public intellectual, a proponent of black social life, a liberation theologian. This means that she could stand in place for several issues. She could theorize, provide social commentary, protest, oppose, curate, and live all at once. It is also essential to mention that she lived, because black activism is often defined by protest in ways that sometimes take away one from their own humanity. She shares the same sentiment as she articulates. At that point, I began a painful journey as I started fighting for the liberation of South African women through writing, speaking, and living. It must be noted that Masenya has lived. However, she became particularly afflicted by patriarchal violence, as she mentioned. Perhaps it is no wonder that in my case, it was only in the early 1980s I became aware of the harsh realities of patriarchy in the academy and in the churches. Once I was introduced to feminist and womanist theologies and biblical interpretation, I would never be the same again. It is easy to argue that her focus was inspired by her biological realities, which I differ against because I do not believe that women choose this kind of activism. We are thrown into it like Heidegger's Dasein by virtue of being women, so we do not have the luxury to choose. She just decided what to do about it. That's what separates her. I would never be the same again, echoes Masenya. I want us to pay a particular undivided attention to this statement, as it will define the politics of Bosadi going forward. It will define her interpretation, it will define her implementation. In saying, I was never the same again, Masenya should tell us if she has ever been to herself, because she possesses a subjecthood that has been banished from the categories of what it means to be human. This is because the advent of curating an idea that will serve as the means to the end of our liberation is only born out of alienation. Masenya enters the academy and orientates her position as a curator of black religious experience. Might I add, this was not an entry that looks like Palm Sunday. In Alice Walker fashion, all her life she had to fight, which does not come as a great shock because she was disrupting business as usual. And she states, I have fought in the academy, which remains both basically white and consequently foreign in the African context. Also predominantly male and therefore less concerned with women's issues. I have fought in the church, which through black remains male regarding its leadership and decision-making practices. It is a church that has continued to marginalize and push aside the female folk through foreign religion, mainly colonial apartheid and male biblical interpretations. I have fought in a predominantly African context whose male folk, although acknowledging the rights of people of all races enriched by the South African institution in practice, still believe the full humanity of women can only be affirmed in the public sphere, of work, and in the realm of church. My struggle is to establish the full humanity of African women in this country, motivated by my desire to discover my self-identity as a human being created in the image of God. It is inspired by the desire to call myself by my name and in my voice. One cannot help but feel irked by the emotions conjured up by this quote that almost reads like a Rivonia trial speech, because generally oppression is unknowingly said, and reading how she had to struggle makes me appreciate her work even more. So despite the pushback, nothing could stop Masenya, such that she even went on, fueled by the desire to call herself by my name, to establish herself and black women's humanity. She went on to do her PhD in biblical studies, specialization in Old Testament, titled Proverbs 31, Turn to 31 in a South African context, a Bosadi womanhood approach. She explains this body of work as focused not only on the socio-historical context of Proverbs 31, but even more importantly on the context of social relations of African South African women who read the Bible. So Masenya, while writing a PhD thesis, mentioned that she sincerely appreciated the reader's critical role during the process of hermeneutics. She, in line with the tradition of deconstructive scholars like Spivak and Derrida, her criticism of textuality and worldling deconstructs a binary opposition between the text and the world. The term worlding is a Spivak register that refers to ways in which writing in general or textuality has provided a rhetorical structure to justify imperial rule. The Bible is an imperial text, which we have seen how many of imperial texts are instrumental into subsidized practices of erasure. We observe in her narrative practices that she often uses the method of autoethnography, connecting her personal experiences to the broader social, political, and cultural contexts that have come to shape her worldview. Her citational and writing practices also reconstruct the myth of objectivity and what scientific scholarship means. She describes her method as socially engaged with academics, but also engaged with the grassroots and communities. The dangers of ethnomethodology in social sciences and humanities is well noted. We are well aware of its risks, and since the way ethnography is composed, sometimes our narrative practices impose distortive interpretative frames on another person's experience. I argue that Masenya was well aware of the risks of ethnomethodology, since it is such a slippery slope, especially when we link such methods of discourse about theories of more significant socio-political questions, for instance, colonialism and apartheid. I argue this point confidently because in Masenya, we find that she aims to de-link from grand narratives through ethnomethodology instead of reading herself into these texts. She uses the text as a blueprint to identify dominant representations of worldling. By identifying them, she now knows what it is that fits in her reality as a process I call transparent representation unbinding. So Masenya alludes to this and says, although the Bosadi reader acknowledges the significance of the context she reproduced by the biblical text, the context of the modern female reader takes priority over the former. So the logical conclusion of transparent representation unbinding is the naming process. After delinking from a grand narrative, one must compose their own rigor and register that shapes the way of their new reality. And Masenya calls it Bosadi Theology. A more comprehensive answer, Masenya calls it Bosadi Theology, a term that guides her hermeneutical practice and how she now engages with the text that once defined her subjectivity with negation and terror. The politics of and etymology are not indexical to Bosadi, since we need to ask what's in a name. Why Bosadi and not something else? The easy answer is that Bosadi aligns with Masenya's ethical foundations and presents as the most accessible synthetical tool for deploying a concept. A more comprehensive answer would be that Masenya ke Mosadi, Masenya is a woman. That inference encapsulates a world of meaning. It is a placeholder for women whom the naming process of grand narratives cannot conceive of. And we see this a lot even in Saidiya Hartman's Wayward Life's Beautiful Experiments. Masenya ke Mosadi becomes a clarion call, an invitation. Ha Masenya ele Mosadi, le nna ke Mosadi mos. If Masenya is a woman, I'm also a woman. It slaps you out of the proverbial slumber. It creates a connection between worlds that we conceive as separate. It makes them collide. In this way, Bosadi also sets out its terms of relationality through sociogeny, then phylogeny. Bosadi in this manner unmarks delusions of grandiosity imposed by false consciousness and bad faith. Bosadi also creates relatedness through affirmation and indigenously in her own words. So since Bosadi is an encounter, encounters often depend on how we identify after encountering it. Naming is integral to the theory and self-identification of Bosadi. It either gives us new names or makes us reclaim the abandoned ones that we prefer. Self-defining is crucial in Bosadi through the practice that we call radical withholding. And we see this as well in practices of critical fabulation, a practice of refusing to be called otherwise and retaining one's own identity. The situation of blacks in general, but black women in particular in South Africa, has been of that of precarity and nervousness, with relative autonomy and lack of agency. So understanding this situatedness for Masenya is essential for intellectual work. As such, How we define ourselves and reclaim our own histories and legacies becomes agitation for change. The change such an endeavor envisions aligns with writing Black women into existence and cements their roles in history that we have been written out of. Bosadi Theology offers us a rubric of agency, one that moves away from pathology. Black women are pathologized more than they are humanized. Therefore, Masenya supplies us with a rubric of affirmation, which is in short supply. In closing, it must be noted that Masenya does not share in my view of Bosadi, of it not being a broad church. Masenya has always been open to different interpretations and audiences, although I always am against this practice. Be as it may, Bosadi Theology has gone on to redefine, shape worldviews, and make sense of our realities. This is a view I partly share here, with the exception that it remains to be true only for the benefit of Black life. Within the struggle for absolute autonomy, where prevailing narratives have failed to represent realities of Black people and women in particular, Bosadi has sufficed to offer an alternative and becomes a placeholder. As Masenya has emphasized in her own work, Bosadi sought to correct gender, class, and racial binaries and ineffectiveness by rewriting and redressing from below. From this reason, I premise Black men and women as being in the underbelly before anyone else. There are many ambitious projects about Masenya's work, mine not included. I would not want to give attention to them here, since I am working on a separate project to address this, and here I only want to focus on the intellectual work that illuminates the sociology of Black life through a dialectical process of care and honor. I am unwavering in my position of reducing Bosadi to Black people's experience because it is a refugee theory. It is not just a collection of the best accessible scenarios, as we see in how Eurofeminist frameworks present themselves, and do not do much in terms of harm reduction. Bosadi expands and complicates the objectives of feminism that are opaque and offers space to more sensitive questions of difference and intellectual heritages that are not mainstream. In my view, Masenya's reputation as a theorist is sealed. She's a scholar for life. I am particularly elated about this because, due to centuries of epistemic violence and coloniality of knowledge, Black scholars have struggled to privilege their own texts. We often herald others as heroes, as thought leaders, a practice we are unlearning. We also note how, generally, Black scholarship is regarded as anarchist and in a state of constant rage, including inducing nausea, suffering from institutional doubt, and lacking epistemic honor and authority. The growing importance of Bosadi is of that of commendable proportions. It has become challenging in a good way. Masenya is unsettling these white men, and I'm here for it. In a good way, in Old Testament studies in South Africa, you cannot do theology today without referencing Masenya. When the broader influence of Masenya is in sociology of Black life, a more focused impact of Masenya's work is on women's studies and feminist theory. She has increasingly been vocal in a criticism of global development and policies that affect women. It is no doubt that Masenya's work will continue to influence, shape the worldviews of many upcoming young theologians. Her work represents critique for critical times. It will forever remain relevant since we are in a constant state of impoverishment, in a world that constantly needs vital analysis. In this, I say, may Masenya live long. Thank you.
I'm too excited. I've even forgotten that I have this responsibility. Thank you, Lerato. Thank you. Thank you so much. Thank you. If there's any questions, this is the time. You can do that whilst Lerato is here in the podium. You can go ahead and ask questions. You ready to answer questions? Or comments?
The question that I have, I guess, is kind of beyond the scope of your lecture, but I'd like to know something about your research on African traditional indigenous religious practices.
Okay. Well, in the At work, I am employed in 2 different departments. So I'm 80% religious studies and I'm 20% Old Testament. And the work that we do in religion studies in relation to African traditional religions is quite essentialist, I won't lie. Yes, it's quite essentialist, it's very ambitious. It engages in these theories of a pre-colonial Africa that I don't believe in. And what we are doing now as a form of retreat to that kind of essentialist religious posturing of African traditional religions is that now we are looking at what we call African indigenous texts. Because now we are about curating archives. It's no longer just about mental preoccupation with these studies. So now we are looking into the archive and see what exists there and see what it can be formed from there. So we are looking at African indigenous texts, and we are also looking at privileging our own texts within that archive. So we are not only writing because we want to return back to a particular state in Africa, because the idea of a pre-colonial Africa in its own is very violent. So what we are doing now is that, and instead of being preoccupied in this constant rage, which I think is beautiful, we are curating this archive on wanting to look at African indigenous texts. So we are asking about issues of existence. We are asking about, I was just telling my friends right now that it's also part of my own project, because when I was writing my PhD, I wrote on Nietzsche and Ecclesiastes. So I was heavily preoccupied with continental philosophy. But within that, I saw potential to bring about a bigger project. So in my PhD, I was looking at nihilism and vanity. So I was looking at Nietzsche and Ecclesiastes to ask, how do we ascribe existential meaning? And the continental canon could not give me an answer. And so this is why we had to retreat and come back and look at African indigenous texts. How do we induct ourselves as African scholars into the school of axiology as well? And no longer looking up to Immanuel Kant, no longer looking up to Descartes. Not that there's anything wrong. They are intellectual interlocutors. Even Spiller, Hortense Spiller says that you should make Heidegger speak your language. But what we are doing is that we want to curate an archive that is going to give us a more human face. So within that, I am growing into a bigger project of saying, I'm going to now look at other sage philosophers that we have in Africa and see how they engage in these issues. Because the continental canon just says that meaninglessness is the concluding remark for reality. And we want to rectify that. So that's the project that we're busy with now. Yes.
Just a quick thing, so you have guided through this. So I'm thinking of, we speak with Sarah in the African context, I guess in the African-American context. Mm-hmm. So many of us, for a long time, I think it provides a comfort to us who've been wondering. For many of us, we've struggled with this whole notion of feminism in an American context, of the role that feminism plays within the African-American context. And by that I mean this. So if you take feminism, and I think it's what you're saying, it's largely based upon a male-female antagonistic relationship, wherein white women would see, generally speaking, white men as someone from whom they should be liberated. And so your presentation gives comfort in that it seems to say that white women are not necessarily victims in this whole enterprise because they benefit from patriarchy and white male supremacy. And so if you were to expropriate that into an African-American context, I guess, what I'm trying to wonder is, what is it like for us in an American context who are critical of the notion that feminism is somehow a refuge for those of us seeking liberation of all African people, meaning that feminism does not provide an adequate answer to African people here or in America, because it's based upon white female antagonisms. And so I heard you saying would be the answer in the African context. So in the African American context, do you see where I'm trying to go? In that we can't just look to feminism as a response to white supremacy. Yes. Right? So then what would be the response in Africa? Because a lot of African American women do identify themselves as feminists, and I've always had a problem with that.
That's not true.
That's not true. I said some. So some African Americans view that.
You have to look at you're arguing. I think I understand your argument, and in this context, But if you have not mentioned womanist theology,
I was
which
going
responds
there.
to everything that you just said.
So I was going there, and so I was saying that womanism and feminism, because womanism is a black African woman's perspective, whereas the black woman does not see the male as someone from whom she should be liberated from, and it's not predicated upon male-female antagonisms. That's what's going on. And so what I'm saying is there are some African American women and men who have rejected womanist theology and see some sense of refuge in feminist ideology.
Feminism for a long time has been regarded as an intramural issue. It deals with immediate sensibilities, right? And we take this from, coming back from the Industrial Revolution, where white women are saying, I don't want to be a housewife anymore, I want to go into the workplace. That's a very immediate sensibility thing. But what black people need is an organizing liberatory framework.
Right.
And this is why I say I want to induct Masenya into that overarching idea and not just to make it an intramural issue. Because what it does is that it creates further divisions. And we don't benefit from that. Because these are the same black men that I need to share a bed with. Right. How can I sleep with my enemy? Right. So it doesn't make sense to me. And this is why, but also when it comes to geopolitics of knowledge, those dynamics, even Masenya says this is in her own work when she engages with Alice Walker. She says, good, it's good and well, I understand womanist theology, but we must understand that Alice Walker is writing from the helm of a superpower. So when it comes to issues of asymmetrical dynamics of power, African American women are sitting with the imperialist. And I'm in Africa. And the hell that is in Africa is sustaining the heaven that is in America. So it becomes those intramural relations. But I always say we can deal with that on our own. That is not something that we take to white women or white men and say, those are intramural issues. Even when you look at the issue of Professor Pakeng, the UCT vice chancellor that was axed, I always say to people, critique Pakeng if you have to. But certain things are intramural issues. We cannot share in the pain of Pakeng with racists. We will deal with her. She's our sister. She's our comrade. We will talk to her at home. But we do not share the idea with racists. And this is why we say that the principle, if we offer each other camaraderie more than brotherhood and sisterhood, we will always stand on the principle. And that will break all of those nitty-gritties that say that I'm black woman, you are a black man. We will say comrade. And I think we saw that in the Black Panther movement. We've seen it even in African politics where they call each other comrades, and that signifies a very, very, very pivotal thing in the theory that they possess, that I see you and me as fighting for a common cause. We cannot be divided. Those are intramural issues, but at the same time, we cannot say that black men should leave their sexism at the feet of white racism. We will deal with you at home. But we always say peace amongst blacks and war to the enemy.
So what would be your response, I think, much to what the two of you just kind of raised, the response that womanism has not situated itself outside of academy in the way in which feminism has. And so what would be the response to help shift, right, outside of the confines of the academy, right, of this oppressive nature into the hands of black women and black people who will never, right, touch the doors of an academic institution, right, to materialize it in a way that they can then embody and embrace for future generations to do.
I think we are dealing with two things here. The first one is a very critical one. Fanon says that besides phylogeny and ontogeny stands sociogeny.
Okay.
So the first one is that we need to operate from that sociogenic principle that says that our operating mandate is that we are dealing with race as the operative logic of racism, which is the logical framework. And that is going to assist us with two things. We are going to understand the inner workings of power. We are going to understand the inner workings of racism. And that also now boils down into other two things. We understand institutional honor of disciplines and the privilege they've enjoyed over time. I always say, when I learned about the Atlantic slave trade, it was when I used to watch wrestling with my grandmother. And she asked me we were looking at Batista, and she said, what nationality do you think he is? Then I was like, he's white. She was like, sit here. And then began the process of learning. So when we begin to get into those mechanisms, we will understand that womanism, womanist theology, now we are just talking about things that enjoy the luxury of being named by ivory towers, but they have been there. So our grandmothers, this is why, when someone says that, we had an issue, we had a moment in South African recent memory where the shutdown movement, the feminism movement, that marched to the richest square mile in Africa. They wanted to shut down business for the day. And then when they got there was a clash. There were issues of ageism, issues of, those boring intramural issues of, so there was the older sect of women who marched, during the height of apartheid, and there was this emerging young generation. And then they said, they have this slogan that they adopted. They say, you strike a woman, you strike a rock, which has come to be critiqued over time. But someone made them aware of something. She said to them, if you want to critique ANC women, fair. But do not erase their lived experiences in such a manner that you will even miss out on opportunity to learn. How did these women organize themselves under surveillance? What can we learn? At the height of surveillance, of black surveillance, these women woke up one day, we saw the streets were littered. So for them, yes, if you strike me, you will strike a rock, because I am able to put myself in those situations. So the fact that now we are enjoying the privilege of calling ourselves feminists and womanists, and we feel like it's only in the pews but not in the pulpit, I think it's disingenuous, because black women have been. The archive exists. The archive is chanting a chorus that says that even in the words of Horton Spillers, even if the world did not need me, they would need to invent me. So we do have theologies on the ground that have been doing the work.
Yes.
May I ask a question?
Okay.
Dr. Parker, go ahead. Okay, what do you say?
Thank you so much, and thank you, because that question of, immediately I was wondering two issues, right? How are women being educated in here? Going back to the previous presentation of Black liberation theology, Black consciousness, that conversation over there, that in so many times, at least from what I've been learning in the United States, have promised to empower women just to make them wait longer, which has been the critique. So how education has been happening? And the second question connected to that, that you began already to point, is what kind of mobilizations, what kind of activisms that we should be aware of Black women here?
Okay. Well, to answer the first question of how the education of women is happening, in a recent interview on Women's Day, my employer interviewed me. They wanted to profile women in the university. And so they said to me, what do you think about women empowerment? Where do you think we are? Blah, blah, blah. So I was like, okay, no, it's fine. We are students of history, and history has no blank pages. And it's because of that I know that this society cannot embrace me as a woman before they embrace me as a human being. So my premise is always this sociogenic principle that I stress. That if we take that sociogenic principle, the Constitution of South Africa says that education is a human right. So if you see me as a human being first, we won't even have the question about women education. We will have the question about education in general. And because now when we do that, it will leave loopholes. My issue is these things threaten black solidarity.
Yes.
So because now, upper class mobility has its own issues as well. So now, you get into the, home setting, and you are importing all of these harmful tendencies and frameworks. But what I remember that interview between Nikki Giovanni and James Baldwin. Yeah. And she says to him, why can't you fake it with me? Fake it with me. And then he says, I can't do it, because I don't see you the way I see him. He, in this context, is the human being. But with you, I need to lie because you don't deserve that honor. But in that sense, I think also Baldwin was also speaking about this internalized social conditioning, social psychopathology that we experience. Even without noticing, you find yourself, enriching these harmful practices and tendencies. But what we need, South Africa needs to if we say that we have the best constitution in the world, then it needs to recognize us as human beings first, before we can even go to, sisterhood, womanhood, those are intramural for me. Those are, let's deal with the question. The principle says black first, land first. And even when it comes to issues of that, we are saying, because even the dialectic even feeds in how we speak about the land issue. People say we want bread. No, we don't want bread. No, I don't want the bakery. No, I don't want the wheat. I want the land. Yes. So that reverse negation. Let's go to the premise. Let's go to the scene of subjection. Call me a human being first, and then we can have a conversation. And then to answer the second question, when we think of movements, the first one I think of is the Circle of Concerned Women Theologians. But institutions are harmful. We can have a good thing, and then it's threatened by bourgeois tendencies and class sensibilities. But they're doing great work. And we have other movements on the ground. But because of my ideological posture, I can only think Hlulani himself is the president of a movement. And within that movement as well, they teach us this, that we are human beings first. So to be honest with you, I am not really active in feminist spaces. I am more involved in black consciousness, Pan-African spaces. And within that, we deal with the question of gender.
Okay. May I quickly? In the States, there's a genre of music that seems to really denigrate women. It troubles me because I'm a little bit older and I came up when women was idolized in a sense. That music is being imported all over the world. It must affect the consciousness of our young men. And I've also seen how our young women have, at times and too often, appropriated those images, those words. I don't know if it's here. I suspect it is. But what are your thoughts about that as being an intentional tool of destruction for our unity as a people, male and female?
Yeah.
And my second question would be, what can we as men do to be good allies, to be good supporters to you who nurtured and made us who we are, really, or are entrusted to raise our sons and daughters?
Well, to answer your first question, I remember a few years ago, I wrote a paper on Jezebel. And I was also thinking about, and within that paper, I came across a case study about how black women are stereotyped in welfare cases. So when they go to the welfare office, they get a very, very, very starkly different treatment than they do white women, because the stereotype is already there. Images of Mammy, Jezebel are already conjured up when you think black women. And that has roots in religiosity. And this is why I trace it back to Jezebel to say biblical texts are cultural entities and they perform in a cultural paradigm. We should never overlook the significance and power of influence when it comes to what biblical text can do in that type of performance. Because it is Jezebel that influenced the picture of Mammy. And it's Mammy that is now influencing the picture of African American and black African women. So we find ourselves constantly locked within that image. And also we need now, because we are here as comrades, I think we also need to be honest about how much we have internalized from that level of hate and self-degradation. And you know, I hear it often, and we often cringe, you know, me and my comrades here, we're like, why do African American men call women female?
Right.
Female what? Female dog, female snake, female what? So, you know, but I'm like, I don't blame them. These are practices that we will unlearn one day. There will come a time where we are unlearning these things. There will come a time where a black woman is not synonym for Jezebel. And, you know, even in the same breath, I also speak about Mrs. Job's wife. When I speak of the influences of biblical texts to say, it's either we're allowed or we are, you know, submissive to a fault. So when we look at these harmful practices, that they emanate, and remember, who owns media?
Yes.
So we have big problems. And you know, secondly, there was a time when I used to believe that allyship is a myth, because I just thought it is just creating a future alibi. And so I thought people were just, you know, I'm extending you camaraderie because, especially in issues of the Me Too movement, I saw it a lot. Because I felt like there were people who were offering allyship because they knew they had future or past victims. So they are buying silence from their comrades as well to say, brother, I stood here with you. I was so shocked to hear that Kamala Harris was speaking up for Megan Thee Stallion. It's like, well, okay, there's something good. I mean, she's annoying, but you know, she stood on principle. And so I think allyship is just creating a future alibi. The mandate should be the principle, black first. Don't harm me, you are harming yourself. So that, for me, it ends there. We are black first and land first. Yes, sir.
Hi, I think mine is a follow-up from the question. The church tends not to celebrate women. And it's across all races, all denominations. I mean, I always say the story of Mary Magdalene, who we will say is the first missionary, the first, the one who goes out there and tells about the stone that has been moved. Yet for centuries she's been sexualized and called names. And that then almost diminishes the value of women within the gospel. What do we need to do as men? Because it was not women that were telling the stories. It's us as ministers. What is it that we need to do to ensure that in our little spaces we rewrite these myths about women? Because sometimes we forget that we also have daughters ourselves, which grow up into this age.
I think then we need to go back and look at the history and formations of Judeo-Christianity, and even in fact Abrahamic religions. Because when we look at the whole idea of monotheism is exclusivity, right? Exclusive veneration. And so at the crux of Christianity, there exists this idea of separatedness and othering. It is no shock that Afrikaner nationalism was Calvinism. So there exists already the idea of othering. And when you go back into their recent history as well, you find that it is purported that the men would wake up and say, thank God I'm alive and thank God I'm not a woman. So already that second classism has already been created. That category exists. And this is why even when I was reading Wilderson's paper on the silent hegemony of the prison slaves, of abolition, reading about that, and then I realized that I consume a lot of crime television. I watch a lot of Paula Zahn, a lot of Aphrodite, a lot of all of these women, and I realized that this is the mechanism of biopower. They are creating within this category of criminality. So this is what I found as well with Judeo-Christianity, that it creates that element in itself. It exists even before it is projected. So the category is already there. It just needs people who are going to fill that vacuum. So then it becomes a problem when you want to even think about why women are not celebrated within church spaces. I don't think we can expect much from people who don't even see themselves as human beings. So I think we have a big issue there of somatocentrism, but that practice needs to be unlearned. That one is not an easy one to answer because me and you have the same struggle, and this is why when we say that we are calling for a total obliteration of these structures, we are not bluffing. We need a more human face. So the church should not celebrate women; it should celebrate people. But obviously, our efforts should be recognized in their differences. We don't take away from that. But the church is in a very special position. They need a lot of working to do themselves.
Yeah.
So, yeah, I think that's where I'll leave that.
Right.
I think I'm done.
One more very simple question, because you said it, and several of the speakers said it, and I don't want us to leave here without really having an articulation and understanding of it. You said that hell here in Africa sustains the heaven in America, and I just can't let that go, and I just need to hear a little bit from you on that.
It's through imperialism. I think the answer is simple. It's through imperialism. Superpowers benefit from the looting of Africa.
That's right.
They benefit from our underdevelopment.
And I'll tell you why I asked it. I understand it from that perspective, but from the black perspective, of people who also are living a certain kind of hell. Do you understand what I'm saying? I just want to make sure that the hell here that's created by imperialists over there who are not us, or even at the danger of there being us, really understanding how we are seen in that context.
Yeah.
Because I'm not sure how we're seen by the continent of Africa in that context. And that's always real.
No, I get that. It can hit home, indeed, when you look at it like that. But I think we can also not deny the harsh realities that imperialism has brought to Africa. Even though we recognize that we have a people like us in the diaspora who are also not benefiting from that. Because I know that you have a crisis of housing, I know that you have a crisis of education, I know that you have many other crises, gun problems. So we do recognize the existence of these intramural contradictions within that same state that functions as the heaven that is sustained by the hell of another state. So those ones are also recognized, because we are not saying we are divorcing from the harsh realities of other people, but also we are saying we are afforded a right to speak authentically about how we feel about the situation. Yes. So, but in that way I understand, and this is why I say the principle will always remain black-faced. Yes. So in anything we do, that is the principle, and it will remain like that.
Thank you.
Now I'm done.